The Diary of a Certified Psychopath. Off the crank. Before proceeding to recount the imminent chain of dry lubed thought, I feel it only just to caution casual eyes that the usual accompanying photographs, be they intended to illustrate, complement, or lend vague credence to the underlying narrative, may be somewhat sparser than usual. This is not something I feel too guilty about, seeing as these days, on what has become the internet's primary independent public broadcasting platform, what passes as quality content frequently comprises groups of sentient beings seated in makeshift studios, casually reclining behind veneered beechwood desktops, usually filmed by two fixed-angled webcams, in front of an array of Shure SMB7 microphones. Seriously, if you're after a large diaphragm dynamic with warm vocal presence, excellent off-centre pickup and unprocessed articulation, then what the hell's wrong with Fraser Crane's iconic Electro Voice RE20? Or if a subtle blend of high-frequency clarity and seamlessly enhanced sibilance is your principal sonic desire, then the bright and infectious sparkle of Bob Heil's legendary PR40 will set your golden ears bristling. Back to the dropped thread. These self-appointed cultural commentators then frequently spend longer than Apocalypse Now the director's cut, conversing, debating, and pontificating in their heavily soundproofed echo chamber about terminally recycled topics or an irreparably broken news story before ultimately arriving at an agreeable disagreement, where negligible common ground is established, before retreating to their own plush live-work spaces to expound with equally long-winded rhetoric about why their best-selling rival vodcaster knows even less about the meaning of life, personal sacrifice, and the nobility of a selfless existence than the knock-off Charles Eames office chair they were sitting in. Then, seemingly with no sense of irony or humility, they will passionately petition their audience for generous donations to a Patreon slush fund, or invite paying subscribers to savour even more laboriously fleshed out and polarised socio-cultural conjecturing that one might very easily garner from a trip round the corner to their nearest libation station. Admittedly, such discourse would be conveyed in several thousand fewer, slightly slurrier syllables, and bear the obligation to cough up for at least one round of locally drafted lager, deposit bottled beer, cask-matured pale ale, or any botanically brewed bitters available for under £3 a hand-pulled pint and 10 cents per blatantly biased criticism. These rates are based on a licensed British pub's current national averages and the typical duration of a drink-fueled discussion following weekly working hours. If you happen to be one of these many career complainers' premium subscribers, it's worth remembering that you're having to both pay for and endure potentially more of such tiresomely subjective dogma with no chance to directly challenge it. Of course, those electing to suffer their self-affirming sermons in a stone-cold, sober state might effectively be cutting their costs by half. But regardless, like I said, I've no shame in providing this hastily compiled hodgepodge of inane observations on the same free-to-air basis as publicly owned Oxygen. With that insufferably prolonged preamble having flown straight over the heads of three partially distracted viewers, if I'm lucky, let us move on to a subject of wholly non-cyclical significance. Because it was by no statistical coincidence whatsoever that the sum disclosed at the end of the previous video in this series, and for those who weren't paying attention, that was £2.80, was, according to exchange rates on an overcast, ash-free Wednesday, during the twilight of a quintessentially bluster-laden British summer, precisely 99.99999811% less than the amount associated with a high-friction trade deal, which our liberated world leader finalised for the purported sale of over $90 billion worth in sustainably farmed products and materials to Europe, from formerly fallow American soil. This historic negotiation supposedly stemmed from the 45th and 7th President's personal pledge to re-establish a secure infrastructure of indigenous workforces employed by US-based businesses upon which the country's richest commercial enterprises and corporations would be compelled to rely, having long depended on outsourced factory labour, mass manufacturing, and the high-volume importing of prefabricated goods to facilitate their exponential profit. This asymmetric trading relationship had incurred a national financial deficit that could, according to the sole president who'd forged a regenerative property empire and fronted up a world-famous television show for aspiring entrepreneurs, only be mitigated through the systemic imposition of elevated tariffs upon all such profusely imported commodities. Can I have my coffee now, please? Not yet! These aggressively raised levies would, in the theory of many, ultimately force all overseas territories who'd accrued substantial net profits at the US's grave expense to reduce their own import taxes, thereby allowing smaller US exporters the opportunity to profitably sell their own homegrown wares abroad. Like that fair trade hand-woven wicker tea caddy I almost bought at a German crafts fair that said made in Kentucky on the handle. Shh! This landmark agreement formed one of several hundred provocative news stories to populate the curated Twitter feeds of every armchair economist on both sides of Western society's terminal political divide, who'd either bothered to vote, wasted at least 3 hours on a weekly podcast explaining to people why they shouldn't, or spent their $10 Amazon gift voucher on a novelty hat. It was also stated to sow the seeds for a prosperous renaissance of the American farming industry. Thus, should you happen to be listening to these words decades after any of the events disclosed within are remotely relevant, or be suffering their unintended consequences, feel free to forget everything you've just heard. Confounding conundrums. Proceeding on the provisional scientific principle that sustaining 1.16 watts for 60 Earth minutes incinerates a single consumable calorie, one could deduce that, during this broadly coast-bound canter through July's farewell hour of ghouls, ghosts, hobnob goblins, and other such frightful fictional creatures evolved from the volatile cocktail of one's vivid imagination and the animated tapestry of transient illusions woven by our wooden wiseacres' leafy limbs and the roadside's incandescent torchbearers, approximately 1.5 kilowatt-hours of mortally generated energy was discharged into the clement night air. However, without any data from a wearable cardiologist, nor details regarding the said mortal's mass, dimensions, or efficiency by which their metabolism can convert macronutrients to burnable fuel sources, this calculation would almost certainly be more generous than Donald Trump's golf handicap. Note that by Strava's routinely conservative standards, even when having selected mountain bike from the 3 available options on my profile's equipment section, which adds a fixed wattage to the ride's average to account for a typical trailblazer's heavier frame and bulkier tyres, then ensured the attributed bone shaker was specified on the activity's settings page, an output of well under half the above figure was estimated. This is because Strava continues to derive its power estimates from a combination of the rider's weight and speed over their route's varying gradients, in what its algorithms assume are neutral conditions with minimal wind resistance, and in the absence of a heart rate monitor, then calculates calorific expenditure solely from the latter figure. As to how grueling this graveyard grind actually felt, tough enough for a lengthy passive cool-off with Coach Sandman.